There is a kind of weight that does not always announce itself loudly. It does not always come through visible chaos or obvious conflict. Instead, it settles quietly into a home, slowly changing the atmosphere until peace feels harder to reach and unity becomes fragile. You may begin to notice small tensions that appear without reason, conversations that turn into arguments over nothing, or a constant undercurrent of restlessness that makes even prayer feel difficult. In many families, this is the first sign that something deeper is affecting the spiritual environment of the home, even if everything on the surface seems normal. When people experience this, they often search for complex explanations. They think about psychology, stress, financial pressure, or personality differences. While these factors can certainly play a role, they do not always explain the full picture. In traditional spiritual theology, the condition of a home is not only shaped by external circumstances, but also by what is allowed to enter it, both physically and spiritually. Every household becomes a kind of environment where influences gather, either leading toward peace or slowly draining it away. This is why discernment is necessary, because not everything that enters a home is neutral. At times, the spiritual condition of a family is affected not by dramatic events, but by ordinary things that are overlooked. Objects placed in rooms, items brought in without reflection, and symbols that carry meaning beyond what the eye immediately sees. In spiritual teaching, especially within a more traditional Catholic framework, material things are never treated as purely empty or disconnected from human intention. What we choose to surround ourselves with often reflects what we value, and over time, it can shape the interior life of a household more than people realize. This is why some homes begin to lose a sense of sacred order without anyone noticing the exact moment it happens. It is not usually sudden. It is gradual, almost imperceptible, like a slow dimming of light. Prayer becomes inconsistent, patience becomes shorter, and family members begin to misunderstand each other more easily. When this pattern appears, it is important to consider not only internal emotional causes, but also the external environment that may be reinforcing disorder instead of peace. Now, the purpose of this reflection is not to create fear, but to restore awareness. A home is never spiritually neutral. It either cooperates with grace or resists it. It either becomes a place where peace is supported or a place where distractions and disorder quietly accumulate. And because of this, attention must be given to what is allowed to remain within it. In spiritual tradition, there is also a strong emphasis on actively inviting God's grace into the home, not only removing what is harmful, but also strengthening what is holy. A house is meant to be more than a living space. It is meant to function as a domestic sanctuary, a place where faith is lived, not just spoken about. This is why families throughout history have used blessings, sacramentals, and consecration as a way of dedicating their homes to God's protection. One of the most important spiritual practices in this regard is the consecration of the family to Jesus through the hands of Mary. This act is understood as a deliberate spiritual commitment, placing the household under divine protection and asking for guidance in daily life. It is not treated as a symbolic gesture alone, but as a real spiritual alignment where the family intentionally seeks to live under grace rather than disorder. In traditional teaching, such consecration is considered a powerful means of strengthening the spiritual foundation of the home. But while prayer and consecration are essential, they are also accompanied by practical discernment. A home cannot be spiritually strengthened while being filled with influences that contradict its purpose. This is where careful attention becomes necessary. What surrounds us in daily life can either support or weaken the spiritual atmosphere of the family, and often the danger is not immediately visible. With that foundation in mind, we now turn to a more direct examination of the specific influences that can quietly disrupt the peace of a home. These are not always dramatic or obvious, but they are significant enough that they should not be ignored. Understanding them is the first step toward restoring clarity, order, and spiritual peace within the household. In the next section, We will begin with the first category of these influences and examine how certain objects, even ordinary ones, can carry a deeper spiritual impact depending on how and why they are brought into the home. Now, let us begin with the first category of dangerous objects that can subtly erode the spiritual life of a home. Objects acquired through envy or vanity. Every item in a household carries with it an intention, and these intentions often reflect the spiritual disposition of the person who brought them into the home. When we purchase simply to outshine others, to show off, or to satisfy a sense of pride, we are not just engaging in a harmless consumer habit. We are, in essence, inviting a spirit of competition, worldliness, and self-centeredness into the very space where our families live, pray, and grow in holiness. Consider carefully the last item you bought, simply to impress someone else or to make yourself appear superior. It may have seemed innocent at the time, but in spiritual terms, it carries a subtle, corrosive influence. The danger is not the object itself, but the intention behind it. Luxury items, designer clothes, or the latest gadgets purchased to feed pride create a kind of monument to vice within the household. Over time, they shape the atmosphere of the home, pulling focus away from humility, simplicity, and dependence on God. The remedy for this begins with discernment. Acknowledging that a particular object was purchased for vanity is the first step toward regaining spiritual balance. The next step is deliberate action. Remove its influence by giving it away. Donation is more than a practical choice. It is a spiritual act that restores order, humility, and focus on what truly matters. By breaking the power of vanity in your home, you are not simply decluttering. You are actively reclaiming your household as a space aligned with grace. Each item you release frees a corner of your home from the subtle pressures that draw hearts toward competition and pride. The practice of examining the reasons behind each acquisition cultivates mindfulness, turning ordinary possessions into instruments of spiritual discernment rather than gateways for distraction or temptation. The second category of spiritual danger in the home involves objects linked to superstition or pagan beliefs. While these items may appear harmless, crystals, lucky charms, or decorative statues, they carry spiritual weight far beyond their aesthetic appeal. From a theological perspective, keeping these items in a home is a direct contradiction of the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Whether intended as decoration or a source of comfort, such items represent an underlying reliance on powers outside of God's providence. Retaining them is, in effect, telling the Lord that his care is insufficient. This act, even if unintentional, opens a subtle door for spiritual disturbances. Families must take this seriously, not out of fear of objects themselves, but because the presence of such items reflects a divided loyalty that can invite negative influences into the home. Clearing a home of these objects is an act of both obedience and spiritual protection. Every charm, talisman, or idol removed creates space for God's presence and the work of angels. When you discard items connected to superstition, you are making a clear declaration that your household relies solely on divine providence, that it honors the supremacy of God in every corner. This act is not just symbolic, it has tangible spiritual consequences, fortifying the home as a space of peace, devotion, and divine order. By removing these influences, the home begins to breathe freely once more, no longer crowded with distractions that contradict faith or open avenues for spiritual unrest. The third danger is subtler but equally important: the absence of sacred symbols. A home devoid of religious images, crucifixes, or medals may appear neutral, yet in spiritual reality, neutrality rarely exists. The presence of holy objects functions as a kind of armor, a visible affirmation of Christ's victory and a daily reminder of God's protective care. Without these symbols, a household is left spiritually unclaimed, even if intentions are pure. Walls filled solely with secular art or family photographs, while emotionally comforting, cannot replace the spiritual authority of sacramentals. Objects like a blessed crucifix, a Saint Benedict medal, or an image of the Blessed Mother are more than decoration. They serve as tangible signs that invite divine protection and the intercession of angels. Their placement in a home creates an environment where holiness is normal, constant, and accessible. Importantly, integrating sacred symbols into a home does not mean transforming it into a cathedral or a museum. Creativity and taste can coexist with piety. A well-placed image of the Blessed Mother in the kitchen, a crucifix near a doorway, or a small medal on a bedside table communicates devotion without disrupting aesthetics. The key is intentionality. Every object should serve as a conduit of grace, guiding the mind and heart toward God. Families who neglect this principle often experience a subtle depletion of spiritual strength, not because they are irreligious, but because the home lacks visual anchors that consistently remind them of the sacred. The discipline of surrounding oneself with holy reminders strengthens prayer life, fortifies unity, and creates an atmosphere where faith naturally flourishes. The fourth category of danger within the home is often the most underestimated because it does not always appear as something clearly spiritual at first glance. It concerns items connected to sinful entertainment, especially in the digital age. What once required effort to access is now constantly present, carried in pockets, placed on desks, and displayed on screens that fill our daily environment. In this way, the modern home has become more exposed than ever before, not through physical objects alone, but through constant streams of content that can shape imagination, desires, and behavior over time. When we speak about this danger, we are not referring only to obvious moral failures, but also to the subtle formation of habits that weaken spiritual discipline. A device that is repeatedly used to access impurity or material that directly mocks the faith does not remain neutral in its effect. It gradually conditions the mind, distorts priorities, and weakens the soul's sensitivity to grace. What begins as casual consumption can slowly become a doorway through which disorder enters the interior, life of a person, and, by extension, the atmosphere of the entire household. This principle extends beyond digital devices and includes all forms of media within the home. Books, films, and online content all carry ideas, and ideas always shape the direction of the human heart. A bookshelf, for example, is not simply storage, it reflects a worldview. If it is filled with philosophies or narratives that undermine faith, encourage moral confusion, or normalize sin, then it becomes more than decoration. It becomes a silent influence shaping thought patterns and weakening spiritual clarity over time. In traditional moral theology, the role of the parent is often described as that of a gatekeeper. This is not a symbolic role, but a real responsibility to discern what enters the domestic space. A household committed to spiritual order must be willing to evaluate media not only for entertainment value, but for its moral and spiritual impact. If something consistently arouses disordered passions, encourages impurity, or weakens the desire for prayer and virtue, then it cannot be considered harmless. Even when it is popular or widely accepted, it must still be judged according to its effect on the soul. The fifth danger, however, is more subtle and often goes unnoticed because it involves things that are not inherently bad. It is the misuse of good objects through lack of moderation. This is where spiritual discipline becomes especially important because the enemy does not always rely on clearly immoral things to lead people away from God. Often he uses good things in disordered ways, slowly drawing attention away from prayer, responsibility, and self-control. Food, entertainment, comfort, and even technology are not evil in themselves. In fact, they are gifts that can serve human life when used properly. The problem arises when attachment replaces discipline and when a person becomes unable to regulate their use. At that point, even something good begins to function as a source of bondage. The key indicator is simple. If a person cannot stop using something when it is time to pray, to fulfill duties, or to serve others, then that object or habit has begun to exercise control over them. This loss of moderation is not merely a behavioral issue, it is a spiritual one. It affects freedom, and in spiritual terms, freedom is essential for growth in virtue. Without self-mastery, the soul becomes increasingly reactive rather than intentional, driven more by impulse than by reason and grace. Over time, this weakens the ability to respond to God's call with clarity and generosity, because the interior life is constantly distracted or divided. In this context, discipline is not about rejection of the world, but proper ordering of it. The goal is not to eliminate comfort or enjoyment, but to ensure that nothing created takes the place of what is higher. When good things are used rightly, they support a life of peace and balance. When they are used without restraint, they become subtle obstacles that gradually erode spiritual strength without being immediately noticed. This is why vigilance is necessary in all areas of the home, not only in what is clearly sinful, but also in what is simply misused. The enemy's strategy is often gradual rather than dramatic. He does not always destroy peace directly. Sometimes he simply distracts, weakens, and slowly reorders priorities until what once felt centered on God begins to drift away from him. A spiritually ordered home, therefore, requires both discernment and discipline. Discernment to recognize what should not be present, and discipline to ensure that even good things remain under control. When both are practiced together, the household becomes more stable, more peaceful, and more resistant to interior disorder. In the final part, we will bring all of these principles together and focus on how a home can be actively strengthened, protected, and restored to a place of lasting spiritual peace. Up to this point, we have examined how certain objects and habits can slowly weaken the spiritual atmosphere of a home. Yet understanding these dangers is only half of the work. Recognition without response changes nothing. A home does not become spiritually stable simply by identifying problems. It must also be actively reoriented toward grace, order, and intentional spiritual life. This is where the focus shifts from removal to restoration, from awareness to disciplined rebuilding. In traditional spiritual teaching, the home is not meant to function as a neutral space where faith is occasionally practiced. It is meant to be a structured environment that supports the soul's movement toward God. This is why the idea of the domestic church is so important. A household is not only a place of residence, but a place where spiritual formation happens continuously through habits, symbols, and daily choices. When this structure is weakened, disorder does not remain passive. It begins to influence thoughts, emotions, and relationships within the family. For this reason, spiritual protection of the home cannot rely on a single action or one-time decision. It requires consistency. Prayer, sacramental life, and intentional choices about the environment all work together. In particular, regular prayer within the home establishes a rhythm that resists confusion and discouragement. When a family prays together or even maintains individual prayer with consistency, the home becomes less susceptible to interior fragmentation because attention is repeatedly redirected toward God rather than scattered across distractions. Another essential element is the deliberate cultivation of sacred presence within the home. This is not about excess or external display, but about meaningful placement of reminders that direct the mind toward the spiritual life. When a person sees a crucifix, a sacred image, or a blessed object in the course of daily activity, it subtly reinforces awareness of God's presence. Over time, these small reminders help shape the interior disposition of the household, encouraging reflection, restraint, and gratitude. However, these external elements are only effective when supported by internal discipline. A home can contain religious symbols and still lack peace if the people within it are not striving for virtue. This is why the formation of habits is just as important as the arrangement of objects. A disciplined life marked by moderation, responsibility, and intentionality strengthens the spiritual atmosphere far more than any external arrangement alone. Without this interior structure, even a well-ordered home can slowly drift into inconsistency and spiritual fatigue. It is also necessary to recognize that spiritual struggle within a home is rarely resolved instantly. More often, it requires perseverance over time. Just as disorder develops gradually, restoration also unfolds gradually. Families may not notice immediate transformation, but consistent effort creates lasting change. Small decisions repeated faithfully begin to reshape the environment, And over time, the atmosphere of the home becomes noticeably different, more stable, more peaceful, and more centered. In this process, one of the most important virtues is vigilance. Vigilance does not mean anxiety or fear. It means attentive awareness. It is the ability to notice when something begins to disrupt peace and to respond appropriately before it becomes deeply rooted. Without vigilance, even a well-intentioned household can slowly accumulate influences that weaken its spiritual foundation. With vigilance, however, a family can respond early, maintaining clarity and direction. Equally important is humility. A home cannot be restored to spiritual order if pride prevents correction. There must be a willingness to evaluate personal habits, possessions, and choices honestly. This includes recognizing when certain things have taken an improper place in daily life. Humility allows for change, while pride resists it. In spiritual terms, humility opens the door for grace to enter and remain active within the household. When these elements come together, prayer, discipline, sacred presence, vigilance, and humility, the home begins to regain its proper orientation. It becomes less reactive to external pressures and more grounded in spiritual stability. Conflicts still arise, as they do in any human environment, but they no longer dominate the atmosphere. Instead, they are gradually placed within a broader framework of peace and understanding. At this stage, the home begins to reflect its intended purpose more clearly. It is no longer simply a collection of rooms and objects, but a structured environment where faith is lived in practical, daily ways. The presence of order becomes noticeable not only in external arrangement, but in the tone of relationships, the rhythm of daily life, and the interior calm of its members. When all these elements are brought together, a clearer picture begins to emerge of what a truly spiritually ordered home looks like. It is not defined by perfection, nor by the absence of all conflict, but by orientation. A home that is oriented toward God remains stable even in moments of difficulty because its foundation is not built on convenience or emotion, but on deliberate spiritual structure. Without this orientation, even peaceful moments can feel fragile, as if they could collapse under pressure. With it, even trials become manageable because the household is anchored in something higher than circumstances. A key truth that must be understood is that spiritual influence is not neutral. Every environment either strengthens the soul or weakens it. This is why the condition of the home matters so deeply in traditional spiritual theology. The home is the first place where habits are formed, where character is shaped, and where the understanding of God is either reinforced or neglected. Over time, what is repeatedly seen, heard, and practiced within the household becomes part of the internal life of its members. For this reason, vigilance over the home is not optional. It is a responsibility. Yet this responsibility is not meant to be carried in fear. It is meant to be lived with clarity and purpose. When a family actively chooses to remove harmful influences, replace them with sacred reminders, and maintain discipline in daily life, the atmosphere of the home begins to change. This change is often subtle at first. There may be a greater sense of calm, fewer unnecessary conflicts, or an increased ability to return to prayer even after moments of tension. These are signs that order is being restored. At the same time, it is important to understand that external changes alone are not sufficient. A spiritually healthy home is ultimately built from within. The interior life of each person in the household plays a decisive role in shaping the overall environment. When individuals commit to virtue, self-control, and regular prayer, the home naturally reflects those choices. In contrast, when disorder is allowed to dominate interior life, it inevitably spreads outward into relationships and surroundings. This is why consistency is more important than intensity. A single moment of effort does not reshape a home, but steady, repeated faithfulness does. Small actions, choosing prayer over distraction, choosing discipline over impulse, choosing gratitude over complaint, gradually build a new spiritual pattern. Over time, these patterns become the foundation of peace. What once felt unstable becomes structured. What once felt heavy begins to lighten. The transformation is not sudden, but it is real. In this context, spiritual protection of the home is not only about avoiding negative influences, but about actively cultivating positive ones. Prayer, sacramental life, and devotion are not additional layers added on top of daily life. They are the structure that supports it. When they are neglected, the home becomes vulnerable to confusion and distraction. When they are embraced, the home gains stability and clarity, even in the midst of external challenges. There is also a deeper reality that must not be overlooked. The home is meant to be a place of grace. It is not simply a functional space for living, but a place where God's presence is welcomed and recognized. When a home is intentionally ordered toward Him, it becomes easier for its members to grow in patience, charity, and understanding. Conflicts do not disappear, but they are transformed in how they are handled. They become opportunities for humility and reconciliation rather than division. Ultimately, the goal is not control, but freedom. True spiritual order does not restrict life. It frees it from unnecessary burdens. When attachments are rightly ordered, when distractions are removed or disciplined, and when the presence of God is honored within the home, a deeper form of peace becomes possible. It is a peace that is not dependent on external conditions, but rooted in spiritual stability. As we conclude, the central message remains clear. A home must be intentionally guarded, not only from visible disorder, but also from subtle influences that gradually weaken its foundation. At the same time, it must be actively filled with what is good, sacred, and life-giving. When both removal and restoration are practiced together, the home becomes what it is meant to be, a place of peace, formation, and divine presence. And now, may this understanding not remain only theoretical, but become lived reality in daily life. May every household that seeks order find the strength to persevere in discipline, the wisdom to discern what must be removed, and the grace to build a home truly centered on God.